Early morning in Brooklyn, sunlight pierced through the thin layer of dust that clung to the large windows of Urban Nest Market, branch number 214. The city had yet to fully awaken, but this worn-down supermarket was already stirring for a new day. Among the stream of people entering through the side door was an unfamiliar face, a man in his early 50s with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair, carrying a crumpled paper bag, dressed in a faded brown jacket and wearing a simple name tag that read, Dave. No one recognized that this stranger was, in fact, Elliot Grant, the founder of Urban Nest Market, who had once graced the cover of Forbes a decade ago. Elliot hadn't come here to supervise, much less to flaunt his authority. He came in silence, with a singular purpose to hear what the reports couldn't say. Lately he'd been receiving vague feedback, not about revenue or expenses, but about something deeper, quieter, a sense of disconnection. A store once known for its warmth now felt cold and disjointed. He chose this location because it was reported to have the lowest staff morale in the entire chain, and he didn't want to keep looking at it from a distance. Inside the stockroom, the fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting pale light over shelves stacked with toilet paper, instant noodles, and bottled water. The clatter of carts rolling across the old tiled floor set a monotonous rhythm. Elliot quietly stepped into the flow, taking the first shift under the brief instruction of a floor manager named Troy, a man with impatient eyes and a voice that always sounded like it was giving orders. Minutes later, while arranging product trays, Elliot noticed someone, a young man around 24, thin, with messy brown hair falling over his forehead. No one introduced him, and no one spoke to him. But it was that silence that caught Elliot's attention. The young man didn't speak, didn't respond to anyone, didn't look around. He simply worked with an astonishingly consistent rhythm. Each tray was placed perfectly, as if he were following some invisible internal blueprint without needing any external guidance. Others in the stockroom paid little attention to his presence, or if they did, it was with sideways glances, half curiosity, half mockery. Elliot overheard one worker whisper, "What's up with that guy? Acts like he's mute." Another snorted, "Even GPS talks. That guy doesn't." Troy stood off to the side, saying nothing, offering no correction. Elliot said nothing either, continuing to observe. That young man whose name, Elliot later learned, was Mason, wasn't just hard-working. He worked as if every single box was part of a logical system only he understood. He flinched from eye contact, recoiled as if loud noises physically hurt. But when a coworker suddenly asked, "Why don't you ever speak?" Mason froze. Not in anger, not in embarrassment, he simply stopped, as though hearing something he knew too well, something that still stung. Elliot no longer wondered what was wrong with Mason. Instead, he began to wonder why hadn't anyone else noticed. Perhaps what made a person seem different wasn't a missing piece within them, but rather a world that had forgotten how to listen to the language they were using. And maybe that language didn't need words at all. Monday morning at Urban Nest 214 began with its usual rhythm. Automatic doors sliding open in waves, carts clattering into each other, and the coffee machine hissing like a habitual grumble. Elliot, under the guise of Dave, entered the stockroom while most employees were still busy restocking the shelves out front. No one noticed him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But there was someone else who seemed nearly invisible in the bustle. Mason. That same quiet presence, eyes avoiding contact, hands never pausing. Mason was reorganizing the entire toilet paper section, a task most employees typically dodged for being dull and thankless. Yet the way Mason did it gave the task rhythm. Reach, scan, place, step back, repeat. No rush, no hesitation, no wasted motion. Elliot stood behind a steel pillar, watching, unable to hide his amazement. He had once said in a leadership meeting, "A good worker doesn't need to speak, they turn labor into music." But now Elliot realized that for Mason, it wasn't just music. It was something more, a refined instinct that surpassed professionalism. Around midday, Elliot walked into the break room, where yellowed ceiling lights cast a tired glow over stainless steel tables speckled with dry coffee stains. He took a seat in a quiet corner, chewing on a protein bar, ears open. Troy leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, speaking in a flat tone just loud enough for everyone to hear. That guy's been here 6 months and hasn't said 5 words. You can't teach someone with zero motivation. A young cashier laughed along, like some AI with mute mode stuck on. Another added, swear he's mapping out floor plans with his eyes or something. Elliot didn't laugh. He simply stirred his weak coffee and let the words drift past him like cold wind slipping through a cracked window. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel, but it was cold, the kind of cold that's most dangerous because it hides behind humor, spreading easily, excused as harmless. In the opposite corner, Clara sat near the old microwave, gently wiping the lid of her lunchbox with a paper napkin. She said nothing, didn't chime in, but when her eyes briefly met Elliot's, he knew she felt it too, that creeping absence of kindness. At the end of the shift, at precisely 11:15, a delayed shipment threw the stockroom into chaos. Troy barked orders, people scrambled. Except for Mason. He didn't panic. He adjusted pace, changed direction, and began reorganizing the entire unloading area in under 15 minutes, a task that usually took 3 others a full hour to sort out. Elliot joined in, lifting boxes, applying labels, saying nothing. Mason didn't flinch. He subtly shifted over, passed a label at just the right moment, nodded when a position aligned. They worked side by side for over an hour without exchanging a single word. Yet the understanding between them was clearer than any meeting Elliot had ever attended. As the lunch break approached, Elliot realized the problem wasn't that Mason didn't speak. The real issue was that no one around him had ever learned how to listen to someone like him. And if that didn't change, it would keep hurting minds like Mason's, quiet but brilliant individuals who didn't seek attention, yet deserved understanding more than anyone. Tuesday afternoon was overcast, gray clouds hanging low over the city like a ceiling pressing down. Inside the stockroom of Urban Nest 214, the fluorescent lights buzzed harshly against peeling walls, emphasizing every dry breath of a space too familiar with silence. Elliot, still wearing the name tag Dave, stepped in as the morning shipment remained untouched. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, barcodes misaligned, carts drifting off track, everything a cluttered draft that had never been rewritten. In the middle of that chaos was Mason, calm, quiet, moving as if he were tidying up something within himself. He didn't rush, didn't complain, only worked with a rhythm that no one had taught, but that was somehow perfectly precise. Elliot paused behind a concrete pillar, clipboard in hand, eyes fixed on each movement, efficient, unrepeatable, exact. Instead of inventorying products as assigned, he began counting the times Mason got it right. The result? Every single one. He decided to try something small. Quietly, Elliot wheeled in a new pallet and subtly rearranged 3 items, placing them in slightly incorrect spots, just enough to go unnoticed by anyone not paying close attention. Then he stepped back, pretending to fuss with packing tape. Mason approached, bending down like he'd done this 100 times. Within 3 seconds, he paused. No scowl, no panic, just calmly shifted each box back into place. When he reached a label with a corner peeling up, Mason hesitated for a moment, then smoothed it down gently like someone straightening a child's collar before school pictures. Elliot could hardly believe it. He tried again this time, swapping 2 nearly identical products, canned green peas and canned lima beans. Visually indistinguishable unless you read the product codes. Mason caught it, no sigh, no head shake, just a simple correction, then back to work as though nothing had happened. Elliot stepped closer. "You've got a sharp eye," he said softly. Mason didn't react. He tried again. "I said you're doing excellent work." Still no response. But after a moment, Mason picked up a barcode scanner, placed it gently in Elliot's hand, then pointed to a nearby inventory sheet, tapping twice on a specific line. Elliot looked. It was an entry he had counted wrong. In that moment, Elliot felt his chest tighten, not because he'd been corrected, but because the person correcting him had done so with such unbelievable gentleness. No blame, no gloating, no arrogance, just a neutral gesture heavy with meaning. I am listening in my own way. For the next 20 minutes, they worked side by side. No words needed. Mason pointed, nodded, signaled, paused. Each gesture was a full sentence, every adjustment, a piece of feedback, every nod, a quiet recognition. Elliot realized this wasn't manual labor anymore. It was a bilingual conversation, one side speaking through motion, the other through silence. When the shift ended, Mason reached into his back pocket and handed Elliot a folded piece of paper without saying a word. Elliot opened it. It was a hand-drawn diagram, neat, color-coded, showing a redesigned layout of the stockroom to reduce unnecessary movement, prevent duplicate inventory, and increase efficiency. At the bottom, in small, slightly shaky handwriting, it read, "Didn't know who to give this to." Elliot folded the paper like it was glass, fragile, precious. Not because the ideas were rare, but because of the trust they carried. And that night, sitting in his car outside the loading bay, he couldn't take his eyes off the drawing. Because clearly in a world where everyone is shouting to be heard, someone had quietly said everything just in a way the rest of us had forgotten how to listen to. The next morning, when Elliot walked into the stockroom, Mason was already there, like a silent constant within the space. The air felt different that day, not because of the light or the people, but because of the thickening stillness layered between the shelves. Mason was scanning the day's delivery manifest, fingers gliding over the boxes, eyes never leaving the barcode list. Elliot didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching the young man run an entire world with a language no one had taught. But that carried perfect structure. As they were sorting paper rolls and floor cleaner, the break room door swung open. Clara, the woman who had remained quiet in every conversation, entered with a small cloth bag and a weathered thermos. She stopped in front of Mason, pulled out a muffin wrapped in a napkin, and placed it in his hand. "Still sugar-free, just like always," she said softly, not waiting for a response, simply offering a small smile before walking away. Mason didn't speak, but his eyes moved slowly toward the muffin, and he folded the napkin gently as if preserving an unspoken thank you. Elliot stepped closer to Clara as she poured her coffee. "You understand him," he said. Clara didn't turn right away. She nodded slightly, and after a quiet beat replied, "I used to have a nephew like Mason. Didn't say much, but when he played with Legos, he didn't just build houses, he built cities. No blueprints, no questions. He saw things others didn't." She turned toward Elliot, glancing at Mason. "He's not broken. He's just different. Problem is, most of us live too loudly to notice what makes someone like that special." That line struck Elliot like a soft bell, not sharp, but far-reaching. Perhaps the cruelest kind of neglect doesn't come from rejection or scolding, but from not even noticing. In all his years of leadership, Elliot had spoken countless times about diversity in memos, in speeches, but never quite thought of it the way Clara just had. Not everyone needs understanding. Some people just need to be seen the right way. That afternoon, Mason and Elliot worked together again on a complicated shipment. They didn't speak, yet missed no beat. From the outside, they looked like two people performing a silent duet, no conductor, no sheet music, just instinct. And in that quiet, Elliot came to a profound realization. What Mason did wasn't just labor, it was devotion without applause. And that made it more worthy than anything Elliot had ever witnessed under the polished lights of a boardroom. Later, as he passed the checkout lanes, Elliot overheard Troy speaking softly to a supervisor from another branch. "That kid? Not a good fit for customer service. Can't even look people in the eye." Elliot didn't stop walking, but his hand tightened slightly around the water bottle he had just pulled from the fridge. It wasn't anger. It was awareness. The awareness that the very system he had built, if left as it was, risked rejecting the very thing it once claimed to uphold, that everyone has value. As if no one is seen, then no one truly exists. And in that moment, he looked back toward the warehouse where Mason was still stacking the final boxes. No one had asked him to. No one was checking. But it was him, not anyone else, who was actually keeping the place running. That afternoon, a gentle rain began to fall. The sound of droplets tapping steadily against the metal roof outside the stockroom was like a reminder of the natural rhythm that people often forget to hear. Inside, Elliot walked in amid a delayed delivery.
The pallet jacks squeaked, boxes cluttered the aisles, and orders were being shouted over each other. But Mason? He remained a fixed point at the eye of the storm, not frantic, not hurried, just calmly reorganizing the sequence, swapping placements, streamlining movements, and suddenly everything settled into order. Elliot observed from a shadowed corner, taking notes with his eyes rather than a pen. Quietly, he pushed a new pallet closer, this one with 24 mixed items. Once again, he intentionally placed 3 boxes slightly out of order, just enough to test attentiveness. Mason approached, glancing once in a look that seemed to have already seen every mistake before it happened. Without a word or any visible reaction, he rearranged each item as if correcting mistyped notes in a chamber music score. Elliot tried again. This time he swapped 2 nearly identical canned goods, peas and green beans, differing only by a small word on the label. Mason noticed. He simply reached out and corrected them without hesitation or needing any confirmation. Elliot slowly walked up, this time to speak with sincerity. "You're doing an excellent job," he said softly. Mason didn't look up, nor did he look away, but after a few seconds he handed Elliot a barcode scanner and gently pointed to a line on the nearby inventory sheet, one that had been flagged. Elliot followed the gesture, then furrowed his brow. It was a mistake his own. In that moment, Elliot felt as if he'd just been taught a lesson not through words but through a calm, unforgettable gesture. Throughout his years in leadership, he had heard countless presentations, rebuttals, critical analyses, but he had never realized that sometimes the quietest correction one made without the need to win could strike deepest at one's sense of integrity. They continued working together in silence. But this time, Elliot didn't lead the rhythm. He learned how to follow Mason not as a CEO, but with respect. Mason didn't use words, but every move he made was a question, every nod was agreement, every pause a thoughtful cue. Elliot, who had spent hours in boardrooms debating how to optimize supply chains, now found himself relearning the most fundamental language, the language of silent precision. As their shift neared its end, Mason pulled a folded paper from his back pocket, handed it to Elliot, and turned away to finish the last row of shelves. Elliot unfolded it. On the page was a hand-drawn diagram, detailed, neat, color-coded, outlining how to restructure the stockroom to reduce handling time, increase inventory efficiency, and avoid repeated overstock. At the bottom, in small, slightly shaky handwriting, was a note. Didn't know who to give this to. Elliot held the paper like a sheet of music never before performed, equal parts admiration and regret. Not because the young employee had such a sharp mind, but because no one had ever asked, searched, or even noticed. How long had Mason been carrying this plan around? And what hurt the most was this: if Elliot hadn't come in disguise, that plan may never have been seen. That night, sitting in his car with the paper on his lap, Elliot didn't need to wait for the monthly report to know something had to change. And change didn't begin with slogans. It began with a moment like this, when someone quietly offered a piece of their mind, and the other person finally listened. Thursday morning arrived cloaked in mist, sunlight barely peeking through the tall buildings. Elliot showed up earlier than usual, stepping into the stockroom just as Mason was beginning to review the inventory list. The young man was the same as ever, dressed in his gray jacket, clipboard in hand, eyes gliding over each product code as if reading a language only he understood. Elliot said nothing. He simply stood there, observing a moment of calm before the tide came in. While they were reorganizing the laundry detergent shelves, the break room door swung open. Clara entered with her usual cup of coffee and small bag of pastries. She smiled when she saw the two working together, then handed Mason a muffin wrapped in a napkin. "No sugar, right?" she asked gently. Mason didn't speak, but nodded just enough to show gratitude. Clara turned to Elliot, her voice soft but firm. "You know, some people aren't born to speak for the world to hear, but to teach the world how to listen to them." Elliot nodded slightly, but inside he knew that today, silence was no longer an option. Near noon, he called an impromptu meeting before lunch, a rare occurrence at Urban Nest 214. Troy looked visibly annoyed while other employees gathered around the break room with coffee cups and wandering eyes. Elliot still wore his Dave uniform, but this time he removed the name tag, shed his jacket, and stepped forward. "I believe I owe you all the truth," he began, his voice not loud but clear in every word. "I'm not Dave. I'm Elliot Langford, CEO of Urban Nest." The room fell still, as if time had frozen. Troy stiffened, his eyes darting rapidly. One employee dropped a cup lid to the floor and didn't pick it up. Mason, standing near the rear door, didn't flinch, just looked at Elliot with an unchanging gaze. "I've spent this past week here, not just to observe procedures, but to understand what internal reports never reflect the way we truly treat one another." Elliot paused, sweeping his gaze across the room. "I've seen someone who works hard, arrives early, stays late, never complains, never demands, and is still seen as a problem simply because he doesn't talk much." Troy shifted uncomfortably, starting to speak, but Elliot raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. This isn't about blame, it's about reflection." He turned slightly, pointing toward Mason. "The person we ignored, mocked, even suggested was unfit for customer service. He's the one who restructured our entire warehouse system, better than the software we paid a fortune to implement." A murmur spread through the room. Clara leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her eyes locked on Mason. "He isn't lazy. He isn't silent because he's incompetent. He's communicating in a language we never bothered to learn and worse, never intended to." Elliot stepped back, his expression softening. "So before you leave tonight, I ask each of you to consider when was the last time you made space for someone different, not because they needed help, but because they deserved to be understood." No one answered, but the atmosphere shifted, no longer tense with defensiveness, but quiet with reflection. Elliot turned to Mason. "I hope you can forgive us for taking so long to see you." Mason didn't speak, but for the first time, he nodded softly, slowly, and with more weight than any thank you could carry. The meeting ended, but no one rushed out. People moved slower, some glancing back at Mason not with judgment, but with recognition of something they had once overlooked. And for Elliot, he knew that moment without applause, without fanfare, marked a real turning point. That evening, as the store gradually emptied, the usual sounds, the beeping of barcodes, the soft screech of carts across the floor faded into a hush, as if the space itself was holding a single lingering note. Elliot didn't leave right away. He stayed in the break room with Clara, seated at the old table where someone had once forgotten a packet of brown sugar now faded with time. Clara poured him a warm cup of coffee, saying nothing. They sat in that quiet as if language had completed its task. After a while, Clara spoke softly. "I heard everything you said today, but what mattered more was the way you looked at him." Elliot nodded, his heart heavy. "I've said countless times that we value diversity, but I never realized that diversity means nothing if we don't know how to listen in different ways." Clara tilted her head toward the stockroom. "Mason has always been different, but that doesn't make him fragile. It just makes him easy to misunderstand. And people often treat what they don't understand as if it's a problem." Elliot smiled faintly, almost with sorrow. "You're right. He's not weak, he's just so unique the rest of us weren't ready for him." Then he stood and stepped out onto the store floor. Mason was at the far end of aisle 6, quietly adjusting misaligned labels, tasks the morning shift always left behind. Elliot approached, this time with no clipboard, no disguise. He stood beside him and pointed at a label turned 90 degrees. "You noticed this before anyone else, didn't you?" Mason didn't answer, but his eyes flicked to the label, then back to Elliot, and he gave a small shrug as if to say, "Of course." Elliot crouched down beside him, straightening each product like a trainee on his first day. "You know," he said gently, "the first thing I did when I started this company was stock shelves just like this. It helped me slow down, see things clearly." He paused. "But I always had the privilege of being seen." Mason reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, edges frayed, thick with squared handwriting. He opened to a middle page and handed it to Elliot. At the top, a title written in capital letters, 10 reasons employees work harder than necessary. Below each point were concise, clear, irrefutable notes. Elliot flipped to the final page. One sentence was underlined. No one ever asked. Elliot felt his throat tighten. The sentence wasn't accusatory. It read like a verdict not for Mason, but for everyone who had ever overlooked him. He whispered, "You've been speaking this whole time. We just didn't know how to hear your language." A few steps behind them, Troy stood. No one knew when he'd arrived. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his eyes lowered, finally caught in an unguarded silence. There were no objections, no justifications, just a man beginning to relearn how to lead. Elliot turned back to Mason. "I can't change how people treated you before, but starting today, I can guarantee one thing. However you choose to express yourself from now on, this place we will listen." Mason didn't smile, but he also didn't lower his head like he usually did. For someone who had lived as though he had to hide himself among the shelves, that single moment of not turning away was a complete answer. The next morning, something felt different at Urban Nest 214, not because of new stock or an upcoming sales campaign. It was the kind of shift that couldn't be named, only sensed, in the way people moved, looked at each other, and paused when it mattered. Elliot arrived early, but he wasn't the first. Troy was already sitting in the break room, hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him, as if searching for something within himself. When Elliot entered, there was no greeting, only a slight nod. But in that silence, Elliot understood something inside Troy had begun to crack. After a few minutes, Troy spoke abruptly. "I looked through Mason's notebook." His voice was hoarse. "I've been in retail for over 20 years. Thought I understood people, but turns out I only knew assumptions." Elliot didn't interrupt. He knew some moments needed to be voiced, not for forgiveness, but to recognize the need for change. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Troy murmured, "but I did by ignoring him." Elliot didn't rush to console. "He doesn't need an apology. He needs you to change now." That afternoon there was no announcement, no agenda, just a brief meeting held right in the break area. This time Mason was present, standing quietly on the edge of the circle, not hiding, not retreating into the stockroom. Clara stood nearby, like a quiet anchor, steady amid a sea of people. Elliot stepped forward, carrying nothing, no iPad, no paperwork, only one thing: presence. "I've learned a lot in the past few days," he began, his voice calm but resonant. "Not just about store operations, but about people. About how we treat those who don't speak in the same rhythm as the majority." Elliot turned to Mason, then back to the group. "We were wrong to think silence meant apathy, wrong to see difference as deficiency, and most wrong for not seeing someone trying through all of it." No one spoke. Even the usual hum of the air conditioning seemed to quiet. Elliot nodded at Troy. This time, the warehouse manager stepped forward. No expression, no nervous fidgeting with his collar like usual. He simply looked at Mason directly, steadily. "I didn't see you. I should have." That was all. No explanation, no defense, just the bare truth. Mason didn't react in any visible way, but he didn't look away. And in that gaze was something only those who've been misunderstood can offer: acknowledgement. Clara stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Mason's shoulder. That gesture, simple yet profound, said, "I stand with you." Elliot concluded, "From now on, the idea of a good leader at Urban Nest will no longer be defined by who speaks the loudest, but by who can recognize value even when it isn't spoken aloud. Everyone in this room will be retrained, not just in skills, but in how to listen, how to communicate with people who process the world differently." He looked around. This store must reflect the world we live in, not just one kind of person. There were no applause, but the entire room seemed to hold a collective, steady breath. Mason quietly turned and walked back into the stockroom, passing everyone. This time, people stepped aside for him not to avoid, but to honor. And then, one by one, though no words were said, each nodded as he passed. It wasn't a grand apology. It was a change through action, and for Mason, that was enough. 1 week after that meeting, Warehouse 214 of Urban Nest looked the same on the outside, but anyone who stepped through could feel that something had changed forever. The air no longer carried the heaviness of judgment or the numbness of indifference. Instead, every small gesture held meaning: a nod in passing, a grateful glance when someone silently shared space, and even those moments when someone genuinely paused to listen. Elliot didn't stop at that location. A week later, he presented a bold plan before the board of directors. Not only did he propose promoting Mason, he also introduced a program called Voice Matters, a pilot initiative focused on identifying, supporting, and empowering employees with unique modes of communication. It wasn't charity nor a PR campaign, but a central part of the company's future direction. At first, a few executives furrowed their brows. One of them asked, "If they can't speak, how do we evaluate their performance?" But he trailed off halfway because the question echoed like an outdated mindset in the year 2025. Elliot didn't respond with data. Instead, he laid on the table a printout scanned from the new internal system, a brightly color-coded warehouse map, optimized for efficiency, bearing a typed header from Mason's device. "I see what others overlook." No one said anything more. Back at Branch 214, the program launched in the next quarter. Mason was appointed Warehouse Optimization Advisor, working 3 days at the site and 2 days at headquarters with access to a new communication tool Elliot had ordered specifically, a compact, sturdy tablet preloaded with an interface customized by Mason himself. It didn't speak for him, it translated how he thought. Mason didn't immediately accept the new position. Elliot saw it in his eyes, that familiar caution of someone who had once been dragged into the spotlight only to be forgotten. So Elliot offered a deal. 3 days in the warehouse, 2 days at HQ. You set your own rhythm. Mason didn't reply right away. But the next morning he arrived earlier than usual, a silent answer that needed no words. The impact wasn't in numbers, but in how people began learning from him. Miguel, the cashier who once joked too much, asked to shadow Mason during inventory runs. Clara started a small mentorship program called The Quiet Strength, supporting younger staff with quiet working styles or communication challenges. Even Troy, who once ruled Mason out of customer service, quietly rewrote the internal training checklist this time, including visual diagrams designed by Mason. One afternoon, when the corporate training team arrived to film footage for the program, the system audio unexpectedly cut out microphone's lost signal. The control room fell silent. People panicked. But Mason, sitting quietly at the end of the aisle, tapped 3 icons, then held up his tablet. "You don't need sound to hear what matters." That sentence was chosen as the official campaign slogan. The Voice Matters program was approved for nationwide rollout in the following quarter. But for Elliot, real success didn't come from a signed memo. It came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, when he returned to the store and saw Mason quietly organizing products according to the new schematic. An elderly man, holding a crumpled note and tapping a cane softly against the floor, asked, "I'm looking for this, for my wife, she's sick." Mason didn't say a word. He read the note, nodded, then led the man through 3 aisles, pointing to the right shelf, the right price, the exact promotion. The man, moved, placed his hand on Mason's and murmured, "You're the only one who's treated me kindly all week." Mason didn't smile or nod. He simply tapped his tablet, then turned the screen to the man. "Thank you. Wishing your wife a speedy recovery." Elliot stood just a few steps away, his eyes blurred not with pride, but with something simpler. At last, Civic Mart hadn't just learned to hear Mason, they had learned how to listen. Spring arrived late in the city that year. Mornings were still cold, the streets still carried the breath of winter. But inside Urban Nest Branch 2 and 14, something had blossomed not from banners hanging high or flash sale campaigns, but from the rhythm of lives once forgotten, now stepping forward into the light. Mason, now working in rotation between headquarters and the store, still spent most of his time in the warehouse. That space was no longer just a place for stocking shelves, it had become a quiet command station, where the operational layout was displayed directly on a screen synced with his device. At first, other employees were hesitant, a bit unsure, but soon they began learning to adapt, just as Mason had spent years learning to adapt himself. That morning, Elliot arrived unannounced. No entourage, no formalities, just a notebook, a pen, and the time to quietly observe. He walked slowly through the aisles, seeing Troy training a new employee using a visual chart one Mason had designed. Clara was arranging a soft rest station, with a few books and noise-canceling headphones for anyone who needed a moment of stillness amid the bustle of retail. Miguel, the same young man who once cracked jokes, was now explaining Mason's inventory schematic to two younger staff, his eyes gleaming like he was sharing a secret not everyone could understand. At the center of it all, Mason remained as he always was, quiet, focused, not seeking attention. But this time, he was no longer alone. He was the center without standing in the middle, a force that kept the entire system running more smoothly through nothing more than his silence. Elliot sat beside Mason during break time, at a small table near the lockers. Mason had already typed a message on his screen before Elliot could speak. "Did you think I wouldn't make it at first?" Elliot laughed, caught off guard by the directness. "No," he answered honestly. "I thought we didn't deserve to keep you." Mason looked down, then typed again. "And now?" Elliot gazed at him for a long moment, then smiled. "Now, you make us more deserving." That week, an internal email circulated across the entire system with the subject, "A new standard." It wasn't just a policy update, it was a new cultural framework, co-written by Mason and employees who had once had no place at the table. It included broader hiring standards, communication training inclusive of introverts, and a mentoring program titled "See Beyond the Surface." The email ended with a quote Mason had entered into his device. "I don't want to be the exception. I want to be the beginning." And 6 months later, Civic Mart reported a 12% increase in internal promotions from previously overlooked groups. Customer satisfaction steadily rose at pilot branches. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. What changed more profoundly was how people spoke to each other. Managers began asking different questions. Staff learned to pause before passing judgment. And the company began listening with intention. A year after the day Elliot first walked into the store under a false name and a warehouse jacket, he returned. No speech, no event. He simply walked through the aisles, smiling at familiar faces. At the customer service counter, he paused in front of a small metal plaque. Not shiny, not flashy, just one finely engraved line. "Everyone has a voice. Some just use a different language." Beneath it, a smaller line read, "In memory of Mason Miller, who helped us listen again." In the back, beyond shelves arranged like a classical symphony, a young man was still doing his work not for titles, not for applause, but because he knew every space, every rhythm of this place better than anyone else. And for the first time, that place knew him too. Mason's story reminds us that not everyone needs to speak loudly to be heard. Sometimes, the most lasting changes come from those who quietly do the right thing, day after day. If you believe that silence carries its own strength, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the words, "Listen deeply."